We are back. I'm Sinead, defense economist and investor.
And I'm Alex, technology and finance writer.
Okay, so firstly, we have to apologize to our amazing listeners for taking a week off. I guess Rory, our great producer, was at his brother's wedding, and we kind of dropped the ball. We flirted for a minute with making some sort of absurd geopolitical documentary in the Middle East before we realized actually we should just stick to our podcast.
Yeah, Sinead wanted us to fly to Mogadishu at one point. Apparently we were going to commandeer a local fishing, but it didn't. I can only assume you're going sort of delirious from lack of sleep. But yeah, we've passed 10 episodes this week. So thank you to everyone who's stuck with us and stuck through our kind of teething problems. We're hoping to get better at this as time goes on. We didn't really think that anyone other than, well, my immediate family members actually, and Sinead's friend Paul, who runs marathons and needs a backing track, actually listened to this. But it turns out a group of you do. So we're both surprised and immensely grateful.
We're super excited about our listeners, especially because there's so much good content online at the minute, like, a new war, Trump's military parade. Did you see that, Alex?
Yes, it was a kind of masterpiece in poor crowd management. Like the way they seemed to
I don't think there was a crowd there to
there
manage.
were like 10,000 people, but they funneled them all into one choke point. So you then had these areas on both sides of the alley that were empty. And you had also the guy who was just sort of carrying a drone above his head. I think you have to accept that the Americans are not a natural parading people. Like the Brits are very good at it, the French are very good at it, but the Americans, it's not really in their national character in the same way.
Well, do you know what the crazy thing is, that I had actually only thought about enlisting, but I was about to enlist in the DoD earlier this year. And I guess when Trump got into government, I kind of pulled out of that plan pretty quickly. And watching that parade, I'm so damn glad that I'm not in it.
What were you going to enlist to do?
So for a long time, I had thought about enlisting in the reserves. And I kind of gone back and forth on whether I wanted to enlist in the Naval Reserves or Space Force. And I kind of chosen Space Force. And I guess I'd started to really rethink that when Trump got in. But I'm glad that I wasn't one of those poor service people trying to march through the Capitol.
Yeah, but it would feel like betrayal, enlisting in another country's military. That would be a separate podcast at some point, Ireland and its policy of neutrality.
But this does bring us to the topic of conversation today. We might not be enlisting in any militaries today, but Alex, that's not to say that we can't create our own nuclear weapon program, right? How do you build your own nuclear weapon? That's what we're going to talk about. Alex and I have decided to do this. Again, Rory, our producer, should not have gone missing for a week. We've been busy having to think of fun things to do in the meantime. So naturally, the first step is finding nuclear fuel. Just casually sourcing uranium, plutonium. Can't be that hard, right?
Yeah, so it's harder than you think, Sinead. So to start with the basics, nuclear weapon relies fundamentally on one thing, and that is, as you alluded to, fissile material, which is extremely volatile radioactive fuel. It's the thing at the heart of the bomb that actually makes it go boom.
Boom, with the capital B. There are two kinds of fissile materials commonly used, as I already mentioned, uranium and plutonium. And without these, you essentially are building an incredibly expensive paperweight.
Yeah, and you can't just use any uranium. Typically, for modern nuclear weapons, you need something called highly enriched uranium, or HEU, which means uranium that has been refined to roughly 90% purity. Whereas, for comparison, the uranium you'd expect to see in a civilian nuclear reactor, depending on the specifics of the exact reactor design. I actually wrote a piece on this recently on the Works in Progress Substack, which is called Nuclear Reactors for Dummies, that actually covers all of that. But yeah, but for your kind of standard sort of pressurized water reactor, you'd expect uranium enriched from around 3 to 5%.
Is this the follow-up, nuclear weapons for dummies? The dummies being us?
Quite possibly.
So the reason enrichment actually matters so much is all down to nuclear physics, which, not going to get into the details of here. But basically, at lower enrichment levels, uranium atoms won't sustain this kind of rapid, explosive chain reaction that you get with nukes. And they'll kind of gently produce energy for powering something like your house instead. But definitely no mushroom clouds at the kind of 3 to 5%.
Yeah. So to get uranium to that weapons grade level, you need centrifuges, which are machines that spin at thousands of rotations per second to separate the lighter uranium 235 from heavier uranium 238 atoms. So yeah, picture a spinning machine to separate cream from coffee, but at supersonic speeds. And
Yeah.
that should be easy.
Well, apparently not really. So, for perspective, Iran's nuclear program has been working towards this kind of enriched uranium capability for, well, over 30 years and still faces substantial tech hurdles. So, even North Korea, which, seems surprisingly proficient at missile tests, struggled through decades of failed attempts before finally managing stable uranium enrichment facilities. And the centrifuges is actually one of the hard parts of that.
Yeah, and fun fact is that North Korea, they used a British reactor design that we basically failed to export to anyone else. So that was a win for us. But yes, uranium isn't your only option. So plutonium is the other route, which is generated as a byproduct in nuclear reactions. But extracting plutonium involves chemically reprocessing spent nuclear fuel, which is extremely dangerous, highly toxic, and politically contentious. And it's sort of the geopolitical equivalent of cooking meth in your garage, which is quite hazardous and definitely not subtle. And so to do this, and this was sort of traditionally the method sort of aspiring nuclear powers would use in the late 1940s and 1950s, that they'd build these kind of huge reactors that would use natural, like not very enriched uranium. And, then there'd be a process where plutonium would be produced and they would try and extract the fuel rods from it. And they'd have to do it really quickly because you'd want the plutonium before it got contaminated with other isotopes. Yeah, the problem is if you're trying you can't really build nukes on the DL using this method. It is very visible on a satellite that you are doing it from very, very far away.
Well, does that mean that we're not going to be able to do this? The Alex and Sinead
Well,
Nuclear Weapon
we probably
Program
won't be
Inc.
able to. Yeah, we probably won't be able to do it like France in 1948, but maybe not all hope's lost.
Well, so historically, nations have tried both methods, as you said, but the US Manhattan Project during World War II actually pursued both simultaneously, both the uranium and plutonium weapons. And, as we are all very aware, they actually eventually dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima and then the plutonium bomb on Nagasaki.
A/B testing, but yeah, here's the kicker. As we were alluding to, it's not too easy to get your hands on either of these materials today. That they're regulated, they're closely monitored by international agencies. Legitimately, fissile materials like uranium are mined in countries like Kazakhstan, Canada, Australia, Namibia, Niger, which are places with these sort of significant natural deposits. You then need to refine it and enrich it, which involves chemically reprocessing the raw uranium into a concentrated powder called yellow cake, which is then converted into uranium hexafluoride gas, which is fed into these industrial scale centrifuges. So these enrichment facilities are very complex, very expensive, very technologically sensitive. And yeah, they only exist in a handful of countries around the world, sort of the kind of major nuclear powers like the US, France, Russia, China, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they guard access quite carefully.
And that kind of means that to buy uranium legally, which Alex and I for our nuclear program absolutely would do, you can't just show up with a credit card and kind of, Amazon next day delivery. You need the extensive paperwork, licenses, and permit. I mean, this is very obvious. These are negotiated at state to state level, not Alex and I going up to someone and asking if we can get, little bit of uranium on the side. International agreements such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty actually strictly regulate who can access the enrichment technology and material. So even trying to get the centrifuges is really hard to do on the DL. And countries outside of this framework, or individuals like Alex and I, are seen as proliferation risks and face intense scrutiny.
Yeah, to be clear, Sinead, you've spent too much time in the US where they have, the First Amendment and you can say what you like. In this country, if you make a joke, like the Metropolitan Police are liable to kind of show up at your front door because they have nothing better to do. So to be clear, we are not trying to buy enriched uranium. Please do not arrest us. But yes, if we were trying to buy some enriched uranium illegally, luckily for us, that is, of course, one of our favorite topics on this show, a black market.
No.
And I know it's shocking what happens when you try and restrict trade in highly valuable commodities, but rogue states or terrorist groups will attempt to acquire uranium or plutonium illegally. And so you really had this in the aftermath of the Soviet Union, because you had all these silos and refineries and facilities dotted around. They usually weren't actually guarded. So they just kind of relied on them being in the middle of nowhere and behind some sort of wire fences. It's kind of assumed that no one would go there. So yeah, in this sort of somewhat chaotic aftermath, there were fears of like loose nukes and this idea that these unsecured nuclear materials would get looted by enterprising businessmen, of which there were many in that era, and that they would find their way onto the black market. The US sort of led these pretty robust international efforts. That was the main one being called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which dramatically reduced that risk.
Wow. In case you are a rogue state actor or a terrorist organization or indeed a podcast maker, even in the rare cases when nuclear material appears on the black market, actually buying it is not as easy as other black markets that we've looked at so far. Insert our favorite theme of our podcast so far, smuggling. So smugglers tend to operate through unsurprisingly shadowy intermediaries and underground networks that stretch across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, even parts of Africa, as we kind of mentioned. And Interpol, along with various three-letter agencies that are dotted across the world, actively track these deals, making successful clandestine purchases really, really hard.
Yeah, I mean, when we've been researching smuggling for other episodes, it usually sort of just boils down to go to this one building in Dubai and they'll just like have all the stuff for you. I know it's always Dubai, but in this case, it's very difficult and your nuclear ambitions risk ending prematurely in a jail cell.
Yeah. So, bottom line up front, for this podcast, we realized that acquiring uranium or plutonium is not just hard, it's kind of impossible, even for podcasters like us who like to make the impossible possible, unless you're already a recognized nuclear state or willing to face severe international consequences, which I am not.
Yeah, but let's put aside the fact that some guy in Dubai won't sell it to us, and we managed to sort of secure this. The next step is you then obviously have to assemble a team that's skilled enough to transform this fissile material into a functioning nuclear weapon. And I think, as we were alluding to, there are quite a few quite complicated chemical and physical processes involved, and you can't just casually learn to do this online.
Yeah. Alex, did you study any of this stuff at school or college?
No, I've got a history degree. I didn't do much practical nuclear engineering.
Okay, great. So we're hiring if anyone's interested. The building this nuclear weapon obviously demands deep expertise across really highly technical fields. So, like, you have nuclear physics, as Alex, you mentioned, to initiate and sustain chain reactions, precise engineering to design and construct bomb components, and metallurgy to handle radioactive materials safely. Which I don't know, if you're doing this on the DL, maybe you don't care about safety, and specialized knowledge in high explosives, obviously. In practice, you need a carefully selected group of scientists and engineers, each probably at the top of their respective fields and working under intense secrecy and immense pressure. And can I just say, for the record, every single person that I've met who works on some of the world's most secretly infamous nuclear programs is like 900% a spook.
Yeah, and this is where it gets difficult, because you have this kind of human side of nuclear proliferation, and it's often basically a mix of brilliance, corruption, and chaos. I think the most notorious example of this is the Pakistani scientist A.Q. Khan, who was the father of Pakistan's nuclear bomb. And in the 80s and 90s, he essentially just started openly selling bomb designs, uranium enrichment blueprints, centrifuge technology to countries like North Korea, Libya, and Iran. I think he was probably the most effective, like, one-man nuclear proliferation agent essentially ever.
I'm surprised VCs aren't all about this. Don't venture capitalists love a little bit of democratization?
Well, this is hardware, so it's too complicated and too difficult for 95% of them.
Far too complicated for Sequoia. But even more dramatically, after the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, thousands of nuclear scientists suddenly found themselves unemployed and desperate, which is not a great situation to find anybody in. You literally had former Soviet physicists posting job ads in newspapers offering their nuclear expertise to whoever would pay for it. And according to US congressional report back in the 90s, up to 20,000 ex-Soviet nuclear scientists became a potential recruitment target targets for rogue states and terrorist groups and podcast makers. And so like imagine LinkedIn today, highly skilled nuclear scientists willing to relocate anywhere with lax export controls.
Yeah, and yeah, even if you manage to recruit these people, they do have a tendency of ending up dead.
I was about to say ending up dead.
I mean, as we saw, if you start working with Iran and advising them on nuclear technology, you are going to end up on a list very, very quickly. And as we saw in both the recent strikes, Israel knows where you are and knows where you live and will happily take you out. I think between 2010 and 2020, like 5 prominent Iranian nuclear scientists died under somewhat suspicious circumstances. One of my favorite ones, it wasn't actually technically about nuclear proliferation, but there was this Canadian scientist who worked for Saddam Hussein, and he was going to build him this like huge, like super artillery piece that could like fire satellites into space. And yeah, he ended up dead on the doorstep of his like apartment building in Brussels.
I mean, when I was at Harvard, was friends with a guy whose name I will not mention. But I mean, not that it matters. You will not be able to find this guy anywhere. And I always thought it was strange in the age of digital everything that the guy would have, a dumb phone, which is to say like a Nokia 3210 or something, no credit cards. I think he was totally unbanked. He wrote everything down on a piece of paper and he was convinced that there were people following him at all times. And, I'm friends with quite a few quirky people, and I just kind of thought this guy is one of the quirkier of them. But he was working on some pretty high profile nuclear work at the time. And I like looking back now, I kind of think maybe I probably shouldn't have been friends with him, but he was probably safer not having an iPhone. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely at the individual level ungodly things that happen to these people. And then at the kind of state level, there's, a lot of sabotage. So Iran's nuclear ambitions famously ran into Stuxnet, which was this kind of large joint cyber attack launched by the US and Israel in around 2010. And it was an advanced computer worm designed to kind of target and physically damage Iranian centrifuges, again, going back to the hardware. And it destroyed nearly 1/5 of them at Iran's Natanz facility, which is in the news a lot this week and last week. And, imagine waking up one day to discover a foreign intelligence service has remotely bricked your billion-dollar nuclear enrichment operation, and there's nothing you can do about that.
And yeah, as you say, like you've got to kind of risk at the human and the technical level. But let's say you defy the odds and the potential Mossad assassination. I don't know why we're working for the Iranians now, but apparently we are. Let's say
Alex,
you like
we are self-sufficient nuclear weapons manufacturers.
I don't think anyone from Mossad is if anyone from Mossad is listening, then I question the Israeli government's prioritization of potential threats. But okay, so sort of you then have to build the warhead, and because you're not trying to just create like an ornamental piece of radioactive sculpture. And this is again not trivial. So you essentially have 2 common delivery systems for nuclear weapons. So first, those are intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine launched ballistic missiles. And then I guess the third, which is less sexy these days, and that's the long-range bombers. And all of these present massive technical, logistical, and financial hurdles. And developing a reliable ICBM, for example, takes decades and billions in R&D. And just to give you an example, the UK Trident is deployed from these, like the small handful of nuclear submarines. Like all of this equipment is quite old and it needs upgrading, and the upgrades to the nuclear deterrent are consuming 1/3 of the UK's defense equipment plan into the 2030s.
Yeah, but it's not just economic challenges, obviously, which are issues for countries with declining economies, let's just say. The technical challenge here is immense. And we kind of forget about that because we've been hearing about ICBMs, these intercontinental ballistic missiles, for so long. But think about this. So to strike a target accurately, you need precision guidance systems, aerodynamic stability, advanced propulsion, thermal shielding to kind of survive the atmospheric re-entry. And the circular error probable, or the CEP, is critical here. And this is the radius within which 50% of missiles are expected to land. So during the Cold War, Soviet missiles had CEPs of 2 to 3 kilometers. Again, this is the kind of range of where you hope they go versus where they actually go, which meant that they were accurate enough to hit, like, let's say, a city, but not a particular district. And think far less precision strike here and more kind of broad urban gesture. And actually, I worked on CEP calculations for the US Navy in the mid 2010s, while other people are doing fun, cool stuff. This was fun and cool, I guess, specifically for cruise and hypersonic missile targeting systems. Think about, as you mentioned, Alex, the Trident system. These have CEPs under 90 meters, which is wildly precise, given that they're kind of launched from these crazy submarines under the ocean. I mean, think about the refraction of your trajectory when you're underwater alone. And then you have the kind of joint air surface standoff missiles, the JSSMs, precision cruise missile, which has a CEP of around 3 meters. And that's small enough to pick a building, not just a block, and to hit it dead on. So yeah, in short, precision isn't given. We kind of assume that these things are easier to build than they are, given that they've been around for so long. But I can confirm firsthand, these require absurd numbers of spreadsheets and engineers and billions of dollars in financing.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a dumb question, Sinead, but when you're firing nuclear missiles, does a CEP of 3 meters versus a CEP of 200 meters actually, like, you're blowing up, like, how many precision strikes on buildings do you need to do with ICBMs? It seems like a very overpowered way of, like, knocking out someone's apartment block.
Yeah, no, for sure. You really care whether your mushroom cloud is like 3 centimeters to the left or 3 centimeters to the right.
Yeah,
You know,
it's fair. I mean, even if you minus that, you also just need the missiles to work, which, again, another problem we've had in the UK is the last 2 times we tried to test Trident missiles, they fell in the sea about a mile from the submarine. So yeah, we hope they work, but I guess from the standpoint of deterrence, it only matters that there's a chance that they could work. And yeah, as I alluded to on the subject of Trident, the economic cost is staggering. And like the US's ground-based strategic deterrence program, which is meant to modernize these ICBMs, is projected to cost over $100 billion. North Korea, by contrast, I think is thought to spend between 5 and 7% of its GDP annually on its missile and nuclear programs during peak development years, which is, it's lucky that their population is otherwise doing so well.
well, even if you've managed to develop these missiles, another one of the big problems here is actually delivering it, not engineering wise, but like kind of policy wise, which seems insane because Jesus, if you're going to nuke the shit out of someone, who cares about policy at that stage? But they do have to go through contested airspace a lot of the time. So like Israel's Iron Dome, for instance, has an interception rate above 90% for short range rockets, as we're seeing at the minute. And its next generation counterparts, David Sling, Arrow 3, they target cruise and ballistic missiles at high altitudes. And Iran, for example, must contend with all of these systems when considering strategic delivery. So if you're going to try to nuke someone, you want to make sure it actually arrives at the place that it's supposed to get in the way that it's supposed to get there.
Yeah, at this point, our hypothetical nuclear program it's running into some issues. So I know we had this idea of, running it like a startup, but I think we're going to need some very, very deep-pocketed investors to make this work, because it's sounding increasingly like state-run black hole of funding, risk, and embarrassment. Putting that aside, I'm going to guess that, as well as money and the technical problems, international bureaucracies aren't going to be wildly keen on this either.
Alex, I don't know why people wouldn't love the thought of us running a shadow nuclear program, but if there's one agency that's going to give a shit, it is the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And we should really think of them as the kind of world's nuclear compliance department, which sounds really boring, but is probably kind of good that it exists. So if you're a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT, you're subject to regular inspections, reporting requirements, and surveillance of nuclear facilities. Iran's nuclear infrastructure, for example, has been inspected more than a Michelin star kitchen, and I've worked in one of those before. Inspectors aren't just peeking in this case. They're not making sure that the food tastes good. They're actually reviewing isotopic data, checking logbooks, and sealing equipment.
Yeah, in the years before the US invasion of Iraq, nuclear inspectors would do these just spot checks on like Iraqi facilities. They would, rock up demanding to be let in, sort of argue with the kind of burly, scary looking Iraqi guards. And there were cases of, even though it turned out Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons. They were so paranoid that like fragments from their old nuclear program or equipment would be misinterpreted that you had these sort of car chases across the Iraqi countryside where they would be desperately trying to move equipment before the inspectors arrived, and they would tail them. But
This reminds me so much of the Olympic doping testing program. They're basically the same.
yeah, I think Olympic cheats are bad. I think comparing them to Saddam Hussein feels harsh.
Now, in fairness, that wasn't a direct comparison.
But yeah, even if you manage to dodge all of this paperwork, obviously, if you're thought to be pursuing an unauthorized nuclear program, you'll find yourself cut off from global finance, arms exports, and even medical isotopes, which obviously has happened to like Iran on and off, and have been in this kind of sanctions cycle. And the theory is classic coercive diplomacy, that if you raise the cost of proliferation so high that outweighs the strategic value of having the bomb.
And in practice, the results are actually brutal. So North Korea has been under heavy UN sanctions since 2006, 2007. Iran's economy, we are aware, has been strangled repeatedly. Its currency devalued over 90% in the past decade, which, this is before last week. And even South Africa, which really quietly built and then even more quietly dismantled its nuclear program back in the 80s and 90s, faced extreme isolation during its development years.
Yeah, those sanctions mean no-go global banking, and you end up trading with the kind of handful of sanctioned friends and sort of hoping your domestic scientists can Google how to fix a leaking reactor. You get the kind of like, are we the baddies moment where you're just sort of sat at the UN and you and the kind of North Korean representatives sort of nodding at each other across the table across the chamber as everyone sort of gives you the cold shoulder.
Isn't the term for this BRICS? I don't know.
Ooh, controversial. And yeah,
That
even
is
if you don't
controversial.
get sanctioned, there's just a good chance, like has happened to the various Middle Eastern actors, that people will just bomb your reactors eventually, as I think happened to Iraq and Syria at different points.
Yeah.
And now Iran.
So building the bomb is hard, financing it really hard, maintaining this kind of shadow secret weapons program under 24/7 surveillance and these kind of crippling sanctions is even harder. This kind of explains why most podcast hosts and rational states just don't do any of this shit.
Yeah, I think, does this mean that we have to talk about Iran now? To compare our hopeless, underfunded podcast run experiment, like Iran's been working towards nuclear capability for over 35 years. Their first enrichment facility, Natanz, was revealed in the early 2000s by I think a dissident group got hold of some photos and just sort of splashed them everywhere. And since then, obviously, as we've alluded to, they've had assassinations, sabotage, and cyber attacks, and pretty harsh sanctions. Yeah.
So technically, I guess, Iran has made serious progress. They've enriched uranium to 60% purity, which is far from the 3 to 5%, Alex, you mentioned, for kind of non-weapons grade use cases. And that is really close to the weapons grade 90%. So that 30% difference, how much harder could that be? But enrichment is only part of the equation, as we mentioned. Iran still needs to design a compact warhead, miniaturize it for delivery, test it, or somehow convince the world it would work without testing, which even Elon Musk, I'm sorry, look at Starship right now. Like that's a bitch of a project to get together. And then integrate all of this with a reliable missile. That's already years of work. And now with the events of the last 2 weeks, it's very unclear whether they've been set back decades or more.
Yeah, I mean, US and Israeli intelligence agencies have always claimed that Iran is months away from, completing a bomb since the early 2000s. The point is a bit of a punchline. Although I do remember back when I was a student, I did some work with a think tank and I was ghostwriting op-eds opposing the Obama-Iran deal, which feels very retro now. And I think that may have been one of the lines we used. But yes, despite perpetually being on the brink, they've never quite crossed the threshold.
Your college years were very cinematic. But maybe all of this is kind of beside the point, because there is a strategic theory in military and nuclear proliferation called nuclear latency. This is something that I got from my friend with the Nokia 3210. The real power actually lies in not having a bomb, but in having the capability to build one really quickly. Remember that 30% difference in enrichment matters. So Iran may be playing that game instead. And this ambiguity between we have a bomb and we're ready to use it, and this kind of, well, we could have a bomb if we wanted to, gives them immense bargaining power and this kind of regional control and deterrence, and will basically leverage in negotiations that do not trigger full-scale retaliation or invasion. However, obviously the caveat here is that this ambiguity is being tested to the extreme right now.
I think calling it ambiguity increasingly was is charitable. I think Sir John Sawyers, who's used to run MI6, had a piece in the FT a week and a half ago saying that Iran essentially brought this on itself with a program that was so obviously non-civilian in intention that this was essentially like inevitably gonna happen at some point. But yeah, when we compare our hypothetical disaster of a weapons program to Iran's real one, the contrast is stark. But because we lack expertise, industrial capacity, and geopolitical insulation, somewhat shockingly. Whereas Iran had, scientists, infrastructure, and political will, and they're still not over the finish line after decades of trying.
Why, Alex, do I feel increasingly sad that Sequoia are not going to invest in our weapons program? But if Iran can't do it, that kind of tells you everything. If this kind of mid-sized regional power with, all the oil revenue, thousands of engineers, well, slightly fewer engineers now, a national security establishment that has struggled for over 30 years under maximum effort. I don't know, 2 podcasters with a whiteboard and a questionable access to anything that's of use to this weapons program. I don't know if we're going to cut it.
I don't even have a whiteboard. Do you?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I know where it is.
Okay, we
have a whiteboard, Alex.
We have a whiteboard. But yeah, so once we've overcome the international systems, physics, intelligence agencies, a very large stack of red flags, we'll secure our multi-billion dollars of funding.
So, Alex, what have we learned from our deeply irresponsible thought experiment? When Rory, by the way, gets back and we've gone through this process of trying to make a weapon, he's not going to be too happy.
I mean, my takeaway from this is that we should have been trying to do this in the 1990s and should have got some ex-Soviet nuclear scientists.
And there were 20,000 of them. We had our opportunity.
Well,
however, in the
1990s... I was not born when the Soviet Union collapsed.
No, and in the 90s, we would have had someone like you writing op-eds against us, and that would have scared us away too.
I was a neocon long after it was cool.
Right, on that note, we're going to end it there for this week. Thank you again to our listeners who are very, very nicely still listening to us, and we shall see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.